Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome back. I'm still working through a lot of the grade stuff for the previous exam on last Friday. I think all I have left to get back is those that are taking the makeup exam or doing SAS at this point. Again, if you had an excused reason for missing it last Friday, even though I told you Monday's the last day to let me know, if you have a good excused absence reason to let me know, come talk to me at some point. Especially if it's COVID or anything like that. I'm happy to work with y'all on this one. Out of curiosity, would anybody be opposed if we went to an online exam for the next exam? Yeah, so in other words, would you rather have, just by a quick show of hands, how many of y'all would rather have an in-person exam? Okay, at least a couple of y'all, okay. We may try to find a way that we do a little bit more of a hybrid, where some of y'all will come take that test with me in person and everybody else takes it online. But again, I don't know if that's even an option. I'm still trying to look into this, but it might be better. Yes. So if it's online, it'd be done through Respondus. That's not my choice, that's biology department's. It's a browser that basically shuts down everything else except for Canvas. It's a webcam. Long story short, with the way Respondus works is you have to have your webcam on. It'll ping it every 5 to 10 seconds. It's video recording, and if it notices like you're looking over to the side a lot or looking down a lot, it'll ping it. And basically, I don't ever look at them unless it pings it and tells me, "Hey, this person looks like they're cheating," and then I'll take a look at it and be like, "Is it just?" Hey, somebody said hello to you as they opened up the door to your room or something. That's one thing, but if it's like actually showing you like on your phone or something, then yeah, we'll have a talk. I would like to try to avoid that as much as possible, to be honest with you. But it just seems like with so many people missing the first exam, it might be an option to explore just in case. Again, I don't even know if the biology department will let me do it, but the way I would set things up hypothetically, if this is even an option. For those of you that wanted to take the test in person, we just meet in here at our normal time. But for those of you that wanted to take it online, I would make it available to everyone from Thursday night at 11:59 p.m. till Saturday morning at 12:01. So in other words, you have the entire day to take it. You have the exact same amount of time. For SAS people, we'd be able to actually manipulate the amount of time in the system. So you have the exact same amount of time. If you wanted to take it in at your house, that's fine too. But again, just out of curiosity, I wanted to see, like, relatively speaking, how many of y'all would be totally opposed to it. Just because it'll make my life easier, especially with so many of y'all missing because of very legitimate reasons. All right, so let's get back to our regular reminders as usual. Today should be slightly shorter, but it's still a little bit dense, so bear with me. Not quiz 3, quiz 4 is due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. If you haven't figured out now, this is kind of the pattern. So if you email me, like by the time we get to like week 6 or 7, that you forgot that there was a quiz this week, there's not much I can help you with on that one, unfortunately. Also, don't forget that many of you still have to take the makeup exam. I think we're still in the neighborhood of like 30 people that have to take it. You have until Friday evening, but you need to take it. And as soon as it closes on Friday evening, I'm not reopening it unless you have a very specific reason why you did not take it in a week's time. All right. Does anybody have any other questions before we get started? Anything from like last class or anything like that is fair game too. Now, do you remember, as I've kind of warned a couple times, this material is a lot more dense than last time. It requires a lot more memorization than that first test. So expect that it'll probably require a good bit more studying. So try to stay on top of that as much as possible. As you noticed in that previous lecture, there's a ridiculous amount of vocabulary terms that you need to know. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about plant form and function. Remember Monday, we talked about what is the structure of prokaryotic cells in a very like basal level. ton of detail, but we're saying this is generally how they're structured. This is generally how they function. Here's a couple of important things that they have about them, whether they have cilia or flagella or what have you. And we kind of covered root ups and fungi, right? For the next 2 days, we're going to be focusing on plants today and then animal systems on Friday. And that's going to transition us into actually going through and starting with the nervous system, endocrine system, digestive system, all that stuff on like a chapter by chapter basis. Now, vegetative plants are divided into parts, kind of like we would divide humans into different systems and all different organ systems and things like that. Primarily, all plants, of course, with biology, there's a million different examples of this not being the case, but it's just how it is. But most plants are based on, have a very basic, body plan structure, where they have stems, leaves, and roots. And each one of these things does different things for the plant and helps keep it alive in different ways. And by specializing in specific things, it allows for that plant to not have to devote, you don't have to worry about one cell doing everything for the whole plant. Now, every vascular plant is primarily going to have stems, leaves, and roots, which are structures that do not participate directly in reproduction. Now, the reproductive stuff is different, and we'll probably touch on that a little bit by the end of this lecture, but So fruits are angiosperm reproductive structures, and we'll talk more about what an angiosperm is later, but just know that it's generally considered to be any flowering plant. So things like magnolias, goldenrod, a lot, any of your basic like classic fruit plants, so like apples, pears, blueberries, raspberries, and that kind of stuff, they're all going to have some sort of are all considered angiosperms. And because of that, anytime that they're releasing their seeds out into the world, they usually wrap it in some sort of fruit. It's not always edible, but that's why technically a tomato is a fruit from a purely botanical sense, even though we treat it more like a vegetable. So just keep that kind of stuff in mind. So in flowering plants, fruits are surrounded by surround the seeds itself, which are going to help carry the plant embryo and protect them from damage. But it can also be a really beneficial aspect of it, where it's going to help to incentivize that seed being spread far and wide. Think of this kind of more common example is you've got birds that will come up and find berries that are sitting in a tree. They'll eat those berries and then fly off somewhere. Process that seed just because birds have terrible digestive systems. That seed will then hatch the next time the animal is, correct. And as a result, it's now this perfectly packaged seed that's been programmed to germinate as soon as it hits the ground. And it has all this excess nutrients that the bird was a process sitting around it, so it can actually, root up and start growing immediately. Now, from a culinary sense, many vegetables are considered fruits. So in the sense of like a lot of the peppers and tomatoes, like I already mentioned, like those are considered botanically fruit. They aren't obviously culinarily fruit. So make sure you're keeping that separate. Now, natural selection can act on plant anatomy incredibly. Obviously, just like everything else, you're going to try to grow and to fit into your environment. You're going to try to find the niche that best serves you. So for instance, this insect-eating sundew, it has vegetative parts that are adapted for carnivorous lifestyle of catching insects, which allows it to survive in nitrogen-poor soil. These sundews you can find right here on campus. They're really cool. Another great example of this is Venus flytraps or the Sarracenia, which are pitcher plants. All three of these plants are designed to have special to allow them to break down animal tissue. What that allows them to do is break down and remove any of the nitrogen that's coming out of those animals, so it doesn't have to rely on the soil. Because these plants are going to be in boggy soil, it's usually pretty low acidity, which allows them to not be able to pull as much nitrogen from it. You can also see some classic examples of this in things like cactuses, which have sharp spines that are there to kind of help save water, in the sense that those spines are going to keep other animals or things like that from trying to eat these cactuses. That way they can preserve as much water inside of their plant body as possible. They're not spending all this energy and water to regrow plant form.
Now, just like everything else, vegetative plants have organs that have to work together to, be able to be a functioning plant. So stems, leaves, and roots are the plant's organs. And these organs are made up of multiple interacting tissues, which are in then turn made up of cells. So remember back to that first day, I showed you the big diagram that it went from atoms to the whole world. This is kind of focusing on that cells, tissue, organ system section. And each cell is specifically designed to carry out particular functions. So a cell that's found in the roots are going to be totally different than the cells that are found in the leaves. Now, plants have what we call a shoot system above ground. These stems are going to basically be there to support the leaves and to carry out photosynthesis to produce sugars. And then the primary role of that shoot or the stem, whatever you want to call it, is that it's going to be the home for the vascular system for these plants, which is going to help transport sugars that are generated in leaves into the rest of the plant. Because obviously, if you can't move, the sugars that's produced up there down to the root tissue, the roots are going to die because they don't have access to that same sugar that the rest of the plant would. So you need to have that development of some sort of vascular system to move things from the top of the plant to the bottom, as well as it's going to help move the minerals and the water that are absorbed from the roots or really anywhere else that's conducting photosynthesis.
Now, stems can be kind of primarily there for structure and for transport. You do often see with a lot of plants that have bright green stems. The stems are also acting in not as efficient as their leaves.
Now, stems consist of a couple different things, primarily nodes and buds. So a couple of different terminology for y'all to keep in mind. You have the space between nodes are called internodes, and leaves attached to the stem at these nodes themselves. Now, you also have the terminal bud, which contains the undifferentiated tissue at the shoot tip. So it's at the very, very end of it. And that's usually where it's basically deciding, am I going to keep being a stem or am I going to become leaf tissue? And finally, at each node, you have something called an auxiliary bud, which is where the new shoot grows out from. So in other words, if you're looking at the plant, you have the terminal one way at the top here, because it's the very top base of the plant. You have this auxiliary bud right here, where you can see it. And then you have leaves that attach to the node. That's where the leaves are there. Now, a lot of plants are grouped taxonomically based off of their stem characteristics. Woody plants in particular are often have very tough bark-covered wood that's there to protect and provide structure for that plant. So they may not be doing a whole lot of photosynthesis in their stems, but they're able to grow a lot taller and to maintain themselves a lot easier in particular circumstances. For instance, there's a lot of pine trees that have developed very hardy bark that's designed to be able to withstand massive fires. However, obviously there's a caveat to everything. If you burn a fire hot enough, it's going to eventually kill the plant. But if you were having, say, if you compared a grass versus a tree, like that pine tree I just mentioned, that grass is going to burn up instantly and you're going to lose the whole plant below or above ground. But that tree is going to be able to stay there and remain solid and probably even be able to continue as soon as the fire's over to photosynthesize and act like normal. But then you get to the herbaceous plants, which have soft green stems. And again, these are things like goldenrod, a lot of the plants you're going to see on the side of the road, a lot of grasses, that sort of stuff. Those are going to have those soft green stems that allow them to still photosynthesize, but they're not going to allow them to get a lot bigger. They're going to kind of stay relatively small compared to something like a tall tree or something like that. Let's move into the next major plant system. That's the root system, which this is pretty much everything below ground, although there are a lot of plants that have designed parts of their root system to actually come up above ground. A great example of this is, how many of y'all have ever walked through some of the palmetto brush that's out in, say, the Arboretum? You'll notice that these big trunks that are sitting on the ground, that's part of the root structure for those palmettos. And even though it's not necessarily, gathering nutrients, by having that large above ground, it allows them to stay and be fairly hardy when it deals with fire. Ultimately, the primary goal for these roots are going to be to transport water and minerals up into the stems. So it's got a lot of cardiovascular stuff, a lot of vascular systems, primarily xylem and phloem that run through most of these things. Their main goal is to be absorbing nutrients or absorbing water. And remember, like we talked about in the last lecture, they can form these very specialized relationships with fungi called mycorrhizae. Allow them to increase their surface area dramatically, and basically allow them to be able to pick up even more nutrients and water or specialized nutrients that they can't normally do on their own. Here's also where you're going to find some specialized organs. For example, some grape tendrils have specialized, almost leaf-like things that are going to form on the stems that are going to allow them to like grip onto other plants to be able to climb up them. You get things like onion bulbs, which they're part of the, technically a leaf, but they're designed to stay underground and be basically there as a nutrient storage system. And similar things for things like carrots, which again, a carrot is a root. So even though botanically it's a root, even though from a culinary perspective, it's considered a vegetable. It's basically a tuber that's going to sit underground and store nutrients for the plant. So that way, if it ever runs into a hard time, it can basically then go back and access that stuff. As for one of the reasons why, if you've ever had just like a potato that just sits in a bag for way too long, that you need to cook, you'll notice after a while you start seeing roots coming out of it. That's where basically that tuber that is the potato is just sitting there chilling, serving as like a storage unit for that plant. And when you remove it from the ground, it's just basically going to sit there and chill until it gets the right conditions to start going back through and germinating roots that can ultimately result in that potato growing up a stem and leaves and all that kind of fun stuff. So it also makes it a really good plant for space exploration because you can pretty easily kind of divide up those potatoes into quarters or halves, bury them, and then they'll usually sprout pretty easily. All right. Let's do a quick review question. Roots depend on shoots because shoots do what? Which was transported to the roots. It's an obnoxious question, I know. Ultimately, you need to know what do shoots do, and that includes the leaves and the stems. How many of y'all think it's A, B, C, D? Yeah, it's primarily there for producing sugars. I know this is kind of stupid, but would you rather be graded on this? And plus, to be honest with you, you'll see these questions again, particularly this one, because it's kind of obnoxious, and if you don't pay attention, you'll miss it. Now, plants are ultimately going to get water and nutrients from the air and soil. Primarily, this is done through the roots, but there are some things that they can pick up through the air, usually in the leaves. And just like animals, plants require the right mix of nutrients to stay healthy. So if they can't obtain whatever they need from their surroundings, they're going to get sick and die. For instance, up in the top left there, you've got an example of water deficiency. And what instantly gives it away is you notice how all of those kind of stems are kind of falling over and not able to maintain that like nice, perfectly up and down straight structure. That's because they don't have enough water pressure, and that's pushing against their different cell walls and keeping that nice rigid structure you normally associate with plants. However, if you get mineral deficiencies, you're going to see discolorations or just odd looking leaves themselves where just it doesn't look like they're growing correctly. And this is kind of stuff that, especially if you're into being a plant mom or a plant dad, it's stuff that matters. So, and if you're not quite right, or if like say the tap water that you get from whatever city that you're in is way too mineral focused, or way too many minerals in it, you can accidentally kill your plants just by watering it with, tap water versus purified water, which is really obnoxious. Now, ultimately, plants require 16 essential elements. These essential elements or essential nutrients are required for metabolism, growth, and reproduction. The primary amount of them are going to be things like carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, which compose about 96% of the plant's dry weight. But then you're going to get to the micronutrients, which are kind of these similar to humans, where you might need a little bit of iron or a little bit of cobalt, these random things that you don't need in like greater than like a single percent of. That's going to take up a lot of that other stuff. So with the macronutrients, plants are going to need a fairly large amount of them, macro large, whereas the micronutrients is stuff that you're going to barely need anything of it at all. Here's a great kind of just kind of like your traditional ones that we're going to see. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are the primary ones. These are going to be a huge part of like just being organic compounds for the plant to be able to grow things like, or create things like cellulose, to be able to process things that exist by making simple sugars, all that kind of fun stuff. Then you get things like nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and sulfur. All of these have very specific roles in the plant where they're maybe helping in creating ATP or helping with specific reactions. So they're needed, and they're needed in a decent amount, but they're not needed as much as, say, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, which are going to contain most of what elements make up a plant. And then finally, we get to those micronutrients, which are things like chlorine, iron, boron, manganese, copper. All these things have very specific roles. I think along the lines of iron has a very specific role in the human body, where you have it very much as a part of like your blood system. Very similar kind of thing. Now, these micronutrients play various regulatory roles in plant processes. So you're going to need them to, kind of help turn on and turn off specific enzymes or specific proteins, so you can actually continue to exist as a plant. Now, ultimately, the leaves take in essential macronutrients by diffusion. So all of your carbon and oxygen atoms are going to come from CO2. And again, they've got specialized cells in the leaf that are going to help them bring in this stuff via diffusion. And those are called stroma. You can actually see it right here. Ultimately, those stroma cells form what we call a stromata, which is this little leaf pore that sits on the bottom of the leaves itself that's going to help it bring in carbon dioxide and release oxygen, as well as release excess water products that it creates. Now, remember back that photosynthesis is going to be disassembling CO2 into atoms through the Calvin cycle. So you need all those waste products to go somewhere. And so leaves are going to take a pretty crucial role in bringing in the CO2 for that, to be able to function and have those photosynthesis processes carried out, as well as getting rid of the oxygen that's kind of left over. Now, roots are going to be there primarily for taking up those essential micronutrients in water. So you can have these symbiotic relationships, like we mentioned, with other organisms, primarily fungi, which are called mycorrhizae, that are going to help plants obtain those micronutrients. But there's other things as well, like bacteria, which are going to help to convert nitrogen. You see this in a lot of bean plants, where they have special nodules that are just designed to house bacteria. And those bacteria are going to help convert unusable nitrogen into usable nitrogen. So a lot of plants just can't suck up the nitrogen gas. They have to have it in very specific ways, either in nitrates or nitrites. And there are also some funguses out there that can help convert things like phosphorus into forms that the plant can use as well. So a lot of that stuff is needed, so it's not just, remember, not everything is immediately accessible, right? So you can't just actively use nitrogen gas. You have to break it down and put it into ways that that plant can then use it to actually function. Another quick review question. Plants require abundant carbon and nitrogen. These elements occur in some of the same organic molecules, including what? Proteins, ATP, DNA, sugar, or all of the above. Right. A, B, C, D, E. Yeah, I figured as much. So yes, all of these things have either carbon or nitrogen primarily in them, everything except for the sugar, because the sugar doesn't usually have nitrogen in it. It's just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, like everything else we're going to talk about, cells are going to have to kind of combine together to form tissue layers. So despite the differences in appearance and structure, these organs are all made up of the same kinds of cells and tissues that you would see in other organisms. For instance, several different tissues make up the roots, stems, and leaves, where you have ground tissue that occupies most of the stem of the herbaceous plant. You have vascular bundles, which are embedded in the ground tissue, which are going to be there to help move various micronutrients, macronutrients, water around the plant. And you have the dermal tissue cover, which is on the outside of the stem there. It's going to help to prevent, attacks from insects or from pathogens or what have you. Now, this ground tissue is going to make up most of the plant body. There's 3 different types of cells that you're primarily going to find in this ground tissue. It's called parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. And these cells that compose these ground tissues are important because they're sites of photosynthesis, respiration, storage, and support. Now, the parenchyma is going to be made up mostly of non-woody tissues, and it's going to help to carry out photosynthesis, as well as respiration and gas exchange. And it's going to be there for storing tissue or storing important nutrients as well, things like the sugars that are generated through photosynthesis. Now, the collenchyma is there for elastic support for growing stems and leaves. So it's going to provide support for those things, but it's not going to be so rigid that you can't add on to it easily. And then finally, you get to the sclerenchyma, which is the inelastic support for non-growing plant parts. In other words, it's going to be the dead center of something like, a 2 or 3 foot across tree, and that where you've actually got the main trunk of the tree. That's usually where you're going to find stuff like that. Granted, it's throughout the entire plant, but that's where you're going to primarily find most of those kinds of things. Those vascular tissues that we mentioned are going to be there for transporting compounds throughout the plant. Now, there are 2 different types of vascular tissues in plants that are arranged in bundles surrounded by ground tissue. So you have the xylem, which is there to move minerals and water. It's primarily through diffusion. So it's purely based off of just pressure and all that kind of fun stuff. And then you have phloem, which is there to move sugars and other organic compounds from the leaves to the rest of the plant. And this is usually facilitated through some sort of active transport to move those compounds and such into the phloem itself. You can't just diffuse things into it. Now, plant vascular tissues that contain xylem are tissues that consist of long, narrow cells called tracheids and wide barrel-shaped cells called vessel elements. These tracheids are going to be there to conduct water and minerals through the pits, whereas these vessel elements are going to actually conduct the water and mineral through the pits and perforated end walls. Basically, it's just there to help move things around. Now, in the phloem, you're going to see something called the sieve tube element, which are the conducting cells, and the companion cells, which are going to be there to transfer materials in and out of the sieve cells. So those sieve tube elements are basically there just kind of like how the phloem or in the xylem was, where it's just moving stuff up and down, whereas the companion cells are there because you can't just have diffusion move things in and out of the phloem. You have to have something that's going to be able to move the sugars where they need to go. Then you're going to get to the dermal tissue that covers most of this plant. In herbaceous plants, it consists of a layer of parenchyma cells called the epidermis, which is coated usually in a waxy cuticle. So if you've ever, particularly magnolia leaves, it feels very waxy to the touch. It's a good example to test this on. And that cuticle also is going to be there to help conserve water and protect the plant from predators and fungal infections. Now, in between the cuticle, there's a couple of openings called stomata. And these, again, are those pores that are going to open and close to regulate gas exchange, CO2 in, oxygen out. And oftentimes, as that oxygen leaves, you do lose some water in the process, which is one of the reasons why you don't see as many of these kinds of pores on the top of a leaf as you do on the bottom. The top of the leaf is usually there being, hit with pretty harsh sunlight, whereas the bottom, you don't have that pressure as much, and so it helps to kind of conserve some of the water and not lose it all every time you open up a stomata. Now, these guard cells are what allow these stomata to open and close. And you don't want to just leave things open because obviously, as you're just sitting there photosynthesizing, you can build up that oxygen a little bit and release it some at a time, instead of just letting it constantly stay open and be constantly losing water in the process. Now, ultimately, all these tissues have to work together in order for the plant to actually function. That ground tissue fills spaces between specialized cell types. The vascular bundles are going to be selected as the plants are transitioned from water to land habitats. And the dermal tissue there is going to help keep the land plants from drying out. All these things kind of show up at different times, and we'll talk more about how the different plant groups are kind of organized. But I at least wanted to put this out there so you kind of had an idea of what the plant system looked like before we start jumping into animal stuff. Obviously, stems are there to support leaves. Monocots and eudicots have different arrangements of vascular tissue. And all that means is basically if you're looking at a monocot, notice that inside of that stem, when we get down to eudicote, which is something like a sunflower, you're going to have nice and smooth, kind of isolated and very predictable patterns. And again, that's to help kind of also provide structure to that plant. Sunflowers can grow a lot taller in a single stem than something like a piece of corn. Now, leaves, as we've kind of mentioned already, are the primary organs of photosynthesis. Leaves can be flattened and have a lot of different structure to them. And they often have what we call a stalk-like petiole, which is going to basically be where you have the main body of the leaf, and then you have that little stem that connects it actually to the true stem. Now, simple leaves are going to have leaves with a single undivided blade. Five lobed part of the leaf itself. Now, the reason why this is a leaf, this is a leaf, this is a leaf, this is a leaf. But any little package you have that auxiliary bud you mentioned earlier, this is something you have to use if you ever have a classified plant. You see there's a single auxiliary bud that's branching out, not a single auxiliary bud for every single little leaf. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, within the leaf and often through a lot of parts of the stem as well are veins. And these are vascular bundles that are going to run along primarily through the leaf. Many monocots are going to have parallel leaves, while most eudicots are going to have netted veins. Now, the ground tissue inside of the leaf itself is called the mesophyll. Now, the mesophyll consists of a bunch of different cells, with many having chloroplasts that are there to help produce sugars via photosynthesis. And these mesophyll cells are going to be there to exchange materials with the air and with the vascular tissue in the leaf. Yes, I know it jumps around a lot, bear with me. Now, roots are going to grow in two main patterns. And again, this is going to be based off of whether it's a monocot or a eudicot. So monocots are going to have long fibrous root systems that are a lot more widespread. They're going to have a big, long net. Whereas eudicots are going to have something what we call taproot. Now, this is really important because that taproot is going to provide a lot of structure. And a lot of eudicots are grow much taller than most of the plants. For instance, longleaf pine. Great, amazing pine tree that can grow upwards of 100 feet tall, live for 400 to 500 years. For the first 10 years that you're going to see it, it's going to look like a bush that's barely about a foot off the ground. Now, what it's doing in that time period is sitting down a massive taproot that allows it to have this huge structure, so that way, anytime the area burns, it's not going to completely lose everything. And then usually, once it hits about age 10, they're going to go from something that's barely a foot off the ground to something that's about 10 to 15 feet up in the air in about a year. Because it's built that huge taproot, it's built all their storage systems down there, and as soon as it's ready to go, it shoots everything right up into the air. And again, just like when you're looking at the stems and the leaves, roots, vascular tissue is also going to be arranged in very different ways. Monocots are going to have vascular tissue surrounding. There's a eudicot kind of solid before with silent flow right side. This is like a nice and centered attached to the back, whereas here you'll find spread out circular flow. Now, the root tips themselves, so the very tip at the end of each root, are very specialized structures. Now, near each root's tip, you're going to have root hairs. These are extensions of the epidermis, which are going to allow it to be able to pull in all those micronutrients. Their extensive surface area is what's going to maximize that absorption of water and minerals from the soil. So the more surface area that you have, the more things you can pull in from the soil, right? And that's why they form those specialized relationships with those fungi. They can massively increase their surface area. All right. More quick review question here. This cross section at the right comes from what? A Eudicot root, a Eudicot stem, a monocot root, or a monocot stem. Give you all a couple seconds to think on this one. How many of y'all think it's A? B? C? D? So in this case, it's a Eudicot stem. Remember, it's a Eudicot root. That's right in the center here. But if it was a monocot root, you would have a circle like right here, be a separation back there. And where that stuff starts is still centralized, but it's not all condensed right into that center. Because here it's still sitting outside. Now, if this was a monocot stem, all of these would just kind of scattered haphazardly through the stem itself. Whereas in this case, they're nice and organized across the whole thing. And that's, again, what kind of gives them that little bit of extra structure. So again, that's a Eudicot stem. Now, plants have this flexible modular growth pattern. By having all these nodes and internodes and things, it allows them to be able to grow from just about any direction. And if any of y'all have ever done any gardening, you'll notice this, especially when you're going through and like trimming up like a hedge or something like that. You'll clip one section of it and it's going to grow out the other way usually. And honestly, plants have this innate sense, and I forget exactly how they do it. There's some sort of chemical communication between the plant itself and other plants, that they will actually grow in particular ways based off of if they're getting particular pressure from predation, or if they're getting a certain amount of sunlight in particular areas, that kind of thing. Now, plants can ultimately grow indefinitely by adding new modules, which are going to consist of those repeated nodes and internodes. And this modular growth is going to really help them to enhance their ability to respond to the environment, right? So ultimately, if a plant is damaged, those non-damaged parts can grow back. We actually take advantage of this a lot when it comes to, especially a lot of fruit plants, fruit trees. We don't actually grow them from seeds, hardly at all. We take clippings and we might merge them into a root system of an entirely different plant. And from those clippings, that's how we get things like apples or pears. I think in particular, it's some specific kind of apple that exists out there. I think it's Macintosh, that there have been no Macintoshes grown from seeds in like 50 years. What they do is they cut off a stem and they grow it and fuse it into the roots of like a pear tree and are able to use that as the way to start the next plant. Really weird. Now, ultimately, plant growth occurs at what we call meristem. So all the plant's new cells are going to come from this meristem, which is a region that is actively undergoing mitotic cell division. And we'll talk more about what cell division is a lot more later on. And this meristem is going to allow the plants to grow, replace damaged parts, and respond to environmental change. The primary growth is going to occur at what we call the apical meristem. Anytime you see A in the first part of a Latin word, it usually means before. So just keep that in mind. And at the apical meristem, you're going to have the tip of the growing shoot, which is going to give rise to the tissues that are going to make up the above ground parts of the plant. And ultimately, this primary growth is going to come from that apical meristem, and that's where you're going to see the lengthening of stems and roots. Now, any secondary growth is going to occur through lateral meristems. And that's usually because it's growing out to the side, right? It's your leaves that are coming off of that stem. The secondary growth is going to provide additional support in woody plants by increasing the width of the stem or roots. And this is also what's going to allow the plant to grow taller than the primary growth would have allowed it to just by its own self. That's why if you've ever, they do the rings on the tree, right? Where after year one, you might have a single ring and then it slowly grows out and out and out. What you're seeing is the results of those lateral movements, even though the apical meristem is way at the top of the tree at this point. This is ultimately what's going to form things like wood and bark. And it's also going to help to create the vascular cambium, which is going to be there to produce things like xylem and phloem tissue. Secondary growth can also form things like cork, which has very specialized roles as well. And that cork can actually be, it's almost like just another form of bark. You can rip it off and use it for other things. Ultimately, this is what's going to make wood durable and super useful. Because if it didn't have all the structural support and the way it's kind of constructed off of a single apical meristem that runs north to south with all these lateral meristems moving out, that's what's going to give it that structure that allows you to not only support the plant itself, but be able to use it for tables and what have you. You're going to have the vascular tissue that's going to be there to transport water, minerals, and sugars. Again, xylem and phloem. Xylem is for water and minerals. Phloem is for any of the organic molecules. And the xylem, again, is going to be there to pull water and dissolve minerals up into the leaves from the roots. And that water evaporation is what's going to generate that gradient. So basically what happens is you've got water being given off through the leaves because of photosynthesis, where you're opening and closing that stomata, the water sneaks out. Because it's doing that and it's releasing all the water from the top of the plant, it's making way for the water that's all kind of, clogged up at the bottom to move to that lower pressure gradient up to the top. It's kind of like, if you've ever seen like the giant, what are they called? The giant water towers. The reason why they're up there like that is to create that similar kind of pressure that you would see in plants. Ultimately, each water molecule, because of cohesion, is going to, move together. And so by creating that pressure gradient, it pulls all of the water up to the top. And again, that's one of the reasons why water is so damn important. And once you, start kind of lessening that gradient on the bottom, it's going to allow water to diffuse in through the roots into the rest of the xylem itself. But again, the more surface area you have, the more areas that you can bring in water from. Now, again, xylem sap is going to move upwards on its own just because of the cohesion of the water molecules itself. Whereas when you're talking about something like phloem, it's going to have to be actively pushed. So ultimately, because water is lost through transpiration and is not replaced, the water movement stops. Now, sugars are going to be pushed down the phloem. The phloem is usually there to transport things like the organic molecules, like the sugars that we talked about. Those are generated in the stems or in the leaves, and those have to move down to the roots to be able to power the roots themselves as well. And so ultimately, you need specialized cells that are going to help push the sugars into the phloem itself and then push whatever's in the phloem down. Now, sugars from the sources are moved into the phloem. These are usually done through those companion cells that we mentioned earlier, and then pushed into the sieve tube, which is where part of the actual phloem structure itself. The water that moves then is going to move by osmosis from the xylem into the sieve tube, which increases the sieve tube pressure. Now, this phloem sap is typically close to about 30% sucrose, and it also contains a lot of amino acids, mRNAs, enzymes, and hormones. So that way the rest of the plant can talk to each other. And it can travel at speeds up to 1 meter an hour, which doesn't sound like a ton, but if you're thinking about how much there is in the single plant, it's pretty incredible. However, there are much faster rates than that based off of diffusion. And the sugars are then unloaded from the phloem into the sink using those transport proteins, which are going to be found inside of those companion cells. Now, ultimately, the water is then going to leave once the water's kind of been, all the sugars and stuff have been taken out of it, it's going to move back into the xylem via osmosis. Now, there's some specialized plants out there that take advantage of some of these various things, primarily by being parasitic. So there are plants out there that are basically designed to tap into the vascular structure of other plants. A great example of this, and you see it a lot more commonly than you might think, is if you've ever noticed, especially once we get closer to November, December timeframe, that there's like a completely solidly dead looking tree, but then there's a couple bright spots of green on it. Usually what that is, that green that you're seeing, is mistletoe. Now, mistletoe we think of, for the holidays, oh, it's cute, everybody kisses under it, whatever. but it's a parasitic plant. The reason why it's green in the middle of the holidays is because it's tapped into the xylem and phloem of that tree and is sucking it dry. So it's a little dark, but it's kind of funny. So, you know, it was the first Christmas horror movie. But, and there's a lot of other ways that, you know, you can have these kind of parasitic relationships. A lot of things like Spanish moss, even though they may not always tap into the structure of the plant itself, will also take a kind of root into that bacteria. And in fact, you can have entire trees that their literal existence is to wrap around another tree, tap into its vascular root system, kill it, and then take it over. They're called strangler things. You can actually see them in Central and South America a lot. They're really cool because basically what happens is something that's like 5 or 6 feet across, but it's hollow on the inside because that's where the whole tree is. And you're calling up oftentimes 40, 50 feet up in the air inside this tree. All right. So, yes, I know this was boring, and I promise it'll get better once we get to actual animal systems because it's a little bit more familiar, and it's not as boring in particular how it's set up. As always, remember, quiz scores due at the end of the week, and make sure you're doing your makeup exams.